Welcome friends to another r/maliciouscompliance video. As always, if you enjoy these videos, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And our first story of the day is by Obnoxious Chocolate. My father abused and kicked me out of my home, so I took everything. I'm not going to drag this out too long, but to get right to the point, my father is very religious to the point that we couldn't do a lot of things that would be considered normal, Christmas, dating, etc. I didn't hate my dad by any means. He taught me a lot. However, he was very abusive. As a black man, he seemed to think the only way to discipline a child was to knock that sense into them. He would constantly get angry at minor things and punch my brother in the soft part of his stomach. I suppose we just both normalized it. And as I got older, I learned to not take the punches and actually block. The first time I did it, it shocked my dad. It was so satisfying not to cry when he did what he did and just look at him with this blank expression. Doing this definitely made him more angry as he would try to make me cry. I feel like it gave him some sick satisfaction. You'd think all of this would make me hate him. Nope. My idiotic self just didn't seem to register how bad this was. I tried to justify it as him teaching me a lesson, but eventually the last straw would come. So I was 16 at the time, and my father gave me this ultimatum: continue school or get a job and pay a majority of the bills. He wasn't working at the time and I hated school. While my grades were average to high, I just didn't want to be a part of that environment anymore. Our overall bill was about 1,300 British pounds, and I'd have to give 600 of my paycheck, with my brother paying the other half. I decided to just go with it and look for a job. Now, a week into my job search, my father started shouting at me, saying I was taking way too long. Keep in mind, when my brother left school, he gave him over 2 months to find something. He ended up putting me in front of a computer and made me apply to things all day and night. I ended up going to bed at 6 a.m. the next morning. I got so desperate I applied for McDonald's and within a day got the job. Unfortunately, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. A lot of inappropriate touching and horrible acquaintances. Anyway, a year into working, a new girl joined the team, and as cliche as it sounds, I fell for her instantly. I went out of my comfort zone and just decided to flirt with her. Within that day, we were dating. It was amazing. Obviously, I couldn't tell my dad about this, so we hid it for another year as we dated. Within that time, we ended up hooking up. Sex before marriage would be a big no-no. My father later found out. Now, this part is pretty invasive, but he had connected to my WhatsApp messages and was reading them on his laptop while I slept. I believe he actually opened my phone while I slept using my thumb recognition. I was chewed out the next morning and told to break up with her, which I didn't, because she was promiscuous and didn't really love me. He then told me to get out of the house and never come back. I'll give some context for this. My dad likes to use this line when we're in trouble. He'll make us go outside our flat and then a minute later call us back inside. He had never really gotten to that point with me, but my brother experienced it all the time. I'd always told him that if my father ever did that to me, I'd just leave. So as you can imagine, I left. I walked for hours while my dad was blowing up my phone to come home. If you thought this was because he cared and wanted me to be safe, you'd be wrong. He would later send texts telling me to not tell anyone what was happening, it was none of their business and I'm not ruining his reputation. I wasn't planning on telling people anyway, but the fact that he said that shows he only cares about others' opinions. Because I'd left so quickly, I hadn't had time to grab anything. I had a phone and the clothes on my back. I had to call my girlfriend for moral support, and after talking, she straight away booked a hotel. I was so thankful. Lucky for me, I was getting paid the next day, so I'd be able to get my money and hopefully rent a place. To this day, I haven't spoken to my father and I completely blocked him. And while I struggle to pay my rent every month, it's still way better than my situation prior. The story does have a happy ending. Remember how I wasn't able to get my stuff? Well, my father had gone on holiday, one of my friends tipped me to this, so my girlfriend and I went back to the house and broke in using a credit card. My dad never locked his door, so if you just swiped a card through the door with enough pressure, you could eventually make it turn and get in. I was actually struggling to do this until the neighbor came by and actually did it for me. He was such a good guy. I know he just assumed we were locked out, but he really saved my life more than he knows. I took everything I wanted, including stuff like the TV, since it was my money that paid for all of that. I can only imagine how shocked my dad was when he came home and found all my stuff gone. He was probably going to sell it to cover the rent. Well, Even if it's sort of anonymous, it probably isn't a great idea to go on Reddit saying you broke into your father's house and basically stole stuff. I don't actually know the legality of that. If you paid for it, but it was in their possession and there's no receipt, wouldn't the eyes of the law maybe kind of lean towards the father? I don't know. Do you think what OP did here was the right thing as far as breaking back in to get all their stuff back? Let me know in the comments down below. Our next story is by SCMG Love, forced to honor contract and then asked to sign a new one. This was over 20 years ago, but I was reminded of it today and thought it would be appreciated here. When I was 16, I got my driver's license and a job delivering the newspaper. I had about 225 papers per day and 300 on Sundays. The pay was decent for a kid, and it only took about 2 hours to finish my deliveries. It was great in the summer. Then school started and it got really hard. I was sleeping in class and making mistakes. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. to deliver, and going to bed early meant I had a serious case of FOMO because my friends hung out until 8 or 9 every day. So I asked my boss if I could get out of my 6-month contract. He was super cool up until this point, and I honestly thought he'd let me slide as long as he had a replacement. I was wrong. He treated me like a villain and gave me the whole speech about honoring our commitments and how I need to learn respect for myself, and if I backed out of the contract then he'd come after me for a bunch of money and fees and penalties. Whatever, I only had 2 months left in my contract. My mom was super cool and would drive my route for me sometimes, and I went to bed earlier. About 2 weeks after the contract discussion with my boss, he stopped by my house to tell me about some changes with my route. He says, yeah, it'll be so great for the customer because instead of 6 a.m., they'll get their paper by 5 a.m. So you should see an increase in happy customers. Oh, and you'll be getting a small raise because from now on, the paper won't be delivered to your house on a pallet. Instead, you'll drive down to a town 15 minutes away and get your papers between 1:30 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. I mean, he pitched this to me like it was the greatest news ever. I reminded him that I'm in high school and I can't be waking up at 1 a.m. and I told him there's no way this is better for me. He kind of blew off my concerns and I said, Don, my contract says that the papers will be delivered to my house no later than 4 a.m. and that it's my responsibility to deliver them by 6 a.m. That is what I agreed to and that is what I will do until my contract is up. He again blew me off and said, oh yeah, no big deal. We'll get you a new contract with the changes, but the end date will be your original end date, so it's all good. I admit that I was not a super clever kid, but I began to see my out. I said I wasn't going to sign a new contract and that I'd recently been taught that it's important to honor the deals we make and how important it was that I follow through with my commitments. He could hear the sarcasm dripping off my words and he thought he could power trip me into compliance. He got mad and threatened to fire me if I don't sign a new contract. I actually laughed at him and said, that'd be great. I was a bit of a little crap to him at this point, and I told him if the papers showed up to my driveway before 4 a.m., then I'd deliver them. But if not, then I'll consider it a breach of contract, and I'd have to terminate my relationship with the newspaper. I was in a great mood and had no problems at all. It was actually my mom who was furious that they'd pull these changes on a high school kid trying to make an honest buck. I was just glad to never deliver another paper. So apparently what I gather from this is that OP didn't have to end up delivering any more papers because Dawn had gone ahead and set the process forward. OP said that they actually saw Dawn occasionally delivering the route that OP had been delivering on. So sometimes they'd see Dawn come by to deliver their paper for the day, and OP would be able to just wave and smile while Dawn dropped the papers off. Our next story is by 4 Top Masts Stay Sail. I guess the car's still mine then. When I was 18 in the late 1990s, I had a silver AMC Spirit with a powder blue interior. I didn't know crap about cars, but it was a sexy little oil dribbling thing. It had bald tires that would spin the car 360 if I didn't brake cautiously, but I loved it. Until it died unexpectedly and I had to have it towed to a shop a week before I was to leave the country for 4 months. I was a kid and didn't know cars, and something major was wrong that I don't remember, but I couldn't afford to fix it. Something like $4 grand to repair. I couldn't afford it and was leaving the country for a while anyway. The mechanic said I could just leave it there and they would just deal with it or scrap it if I didn't care. Cool. I no longer have a car, but I'm leaving anyway, so who cares? I paid the bill for the work they did and left. When I got home from my many months abroad, I went through a massive stack of mail that included one letter saying the car had been impounded, another that had been auctioned off, and after the auction date, several parking tickets that amounted to about $400. I called the city and asked how I could be liable for parking tickets after the car was auctioned to a new owner. They said it was still in my name. The new owner hadn't changed the title, it was my responsibility. I was furious, but what could I do? The title was in my name, and they couldn't even give me the name of the person who bought it. I had to pay, or it would be sent to collections. So I'm walking to my friend's apartment a block away from my old place, and right across the street from her building, I see my car. I still have the keys, so I go home and frantically grab them and go back. I get into the car and start pulling all the papers from the glove box and sort through them looking for the new owner's name. Just then, two guys run up screaming that I'm in their car and what the freak do I think I'm doing? I say, you bought it from auction and didn't change the title. You owe me $400 for the parking tickets in my name. They insist they don't owe me crap. Not my fault you left it in your name. I smile and calmly start the engine and say, okay then, it's in my name, it's legally mine, and drive away. Thanks for repairing the engine. Honestly, I wouldn't even begin to know the legality of this, but the fact is, that person who bought the car from auction had ample time to change the title. And then they go and rack up parking tickets and they're gonna try and make OP pay for them? Well shoot, okay, I'll take the parking tickets and the car too, thanks. And our final story of the day is by Awk Lemon. Boss told me, if you don't like it, then leave. When I was younger, I worked as an engineer for a small company. The owner, who I'll call Jake, let me know before I started that I would be doing about 10-hour days, 6 days a week for about 6 months, but that I would have to be flexible. Some days they wouldn't have work for me, and other days I'd be expected to stay a few hours late. This didn't bother me too much as I wasn't too tight for money and I didn't mind staying behind a few extra hours occasionally. I got to work and was told to follow instructions from the owner's brother, Steve. He was an arrogant character who always thought he knew how to do everyone else's job better than them. We butted heads a few times, but nothing major. A few months in, I found a new job starting in a week that paid better. Later on that day, I had another disagreement with Steve. The situation was petty, but it's his response that really confused me. It ended with him screaming in my face, "If you don't do as I say, then you can freaking leave." So I packed my stuff and left. Steve was a little confused, thinking I'd just fall in line. He was too arrogant to apologize, and I had a job lined up. Side note for people not in the UK, I was working a 0-hour contract. This means I get an hourly wage, but I'm not afforded some labor rights like a set salary, minimum work hours, or notice for dismissal. This works both ways though, so I can leave the job whenever I want with no notice. I decided to call up Jake since he'd always been chill and told him what happened. He told me he needed me and I should just return to work. I told him unless he controls Steve and made him apologize, there was no way I was coming back. He refused, so I told him I'll send in my final timesheet. 2 weeks later, and I've started my new job. I still haven't been paid for my final week, so I called Jake. He told me that, since you didn't give notice for leaving, you owe me for lost product of work. He said if I didn't like it, I should sue him and recommended I should just take the loss and move on. This was complete BS. A couple months go by until I finally find time to file for small claims court. A few days after sending him notice, Jake paid my money, including court fees and extra. He actually called me up apologizing for the confusion. He wanted to know when I could return to work. I'd heard from one of my ex-coworkers that because of the infrequent hours, people would leave as soon as they were told they wouldn't have work the next day. Others would leave when they realized how much of a jerk Steve was. They'd gone through about 7 different workers in the time I was gone and struggled to keep anyone for more than a week. I told him I'd think about it. I managed to string him along for a few weeks before he stopped calling me. The moral of the story is that if you think you're being treated unfairly, you shouldn't just put up with it. Your self-respect isn't worth compromising. Don't settle for being treated like poop, especially when you're willing to go above and beyond for them. And it's not always the case, but on the opposite side of things, I could say it's very true that if somebody treats you really good, gives you flexibility, compromises with you, tries to do everything they can to make you happy, you might be more willing to stay with them even if you're getting paid not as much as you could elsewhere. It's really all about the conditions that people create and how well they treat people like real human beings and try to have actual meaningful connection. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So of all these stories I've read today, which is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't yet, if you could like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. Whatever you do, whether it's liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, all of it helps grow this channel and I appreciate the heck out of it. So until next time, I'll see you all tomorrow with some more stories.